So we have chosen to heal. Yes, to heal. We've been talking about forgiveness together, and we said last week that the key point in this conversation is a choice we make. Now, it's a choice we make in community. It's a choice we make. Often it takes a bit of time, but we choose healing. And in fact, I invited us to kind of double down on it, double down on healing, make a choice to heal. And so in that choice, there's this movement that Tutu tells us about. And it's a movement that reminds us that forgiveness is not just this point in time that happens very quickly in our lives, but it is a process in time that takes time. And in the end, no one can tell us how long that takes. As long as we're still day to day, moment to moment, committed to healing. And we said last week, and I'll remind you today, that the first step in this process was to tell the story, to tell it and retell it. And that story rooted in the reality that we have faced. If someone has hurt or harmed or caused loss to us. Now, no one can tell our story better than ourselves, and so we tell it. And so we provide a community that is willing to listen to our stories. And it sounds wonderful, and you and I both know that when we've had an experience that's difficult, we naturally, as humans, have a tendency to want to tell the story anyway. So creating spaces where that story can be told. And now we're heading to the second part, the second step in this process of forgiveness. And that is to name the harm. So we tell our story, but then we name the harm. Now, Tutu reminds us that it's important that we remember that naming the harm, it's not about us wanting to hyper-focus on ourselves and be always in this victim mentality. No, that naming the harm is rooted in the reality that when there is a harm done to us, when we're hurt in any way, when we suffer a loss, that experience does something within us. Now, this is true from the kind of highest level of a dignity violation to the smallest level. But it's something that we need to remember because in our culture, it's so typical for us to just want to move on. And how often sometimes we say that to folks who come to us who have been hurt or harmed or have suffered loss. We hear very superficially, and we just say, well, oh, I hear you, but why don't you move on? Why don't you just forget about it? And it is that cultural tendency to want to just move on that can cause actually further harm, and that actually doesn't help us in our healing journey, but does the opposite, right? So the first recognition is a recognition that when there's hurt, harm, or loss, that there's harm that has taken place, and that harm sometimes is deep in our bones. In cases of violence against another, there might be even physical signs of that hurt or harm, right? But sometimes we cannot see it. It is deeply emotional harm. In words, even though we were told as kids, as Tutu reminds us that words cannot hurt us, we know better, don't we? Words can indeed hurt us, and deeply. And so there is a recognition that something has changed in us when someone has harmed us or hurt us or has caused us loss. Something has been transformed in the other when we have caused them harm or we have hurt them or have caused them loss. It's part of what it means to be human as emotional, physical beings in the world. And so as in the story of Jacob and Esau that we've been telling together, this engagement between these two brothers, this trickery of Jacob has caused an actual harm to his brother and has actually separated his brother from those kinship connections that he has, especially the connection with someone he loves so deeply, his father. It's part of what happened today, right? Jacob's trickery with his father meant that then Jacob received the blessing that belonged to Esau. And now it's not just that Esau no longer received the blessing as the firstborn, it's that Esau now lost his connection with the person who loved him the most in this family, his father Isaac. And so when we cause harm or when we are harmed, there is a literal break in connection. And often there's a break in connections with our true selves too. And so in order for us to be in a journey of healing, in order for us to be in a journey of forgiveness, then we need to rehearse the harm that has been done to us. Now, as Tutu reminds us, this activity that seems so simple can get a bit more complicated because often we need to recover the language of feelings, of the way in which this event has shaped us, because we have so deeply been shaped and moving on, we have even lost the language, the words to describe to that other what has happened here. When my children were little, sometimes me as a dad in my disciplining of them, and let's remember that discipline is teaching. We tend to forget that in our culture. We often think of discipline as punishment, but actually the word discipline means to teach something to that other. So sometimes in my disciplining, I would mess up. So I'm confessing that as a father, I messed up. And what's fascinating is that early on we began to try to practice this idea of forgiveness and reconciliation. So when I messed up, then I had a duty to go to this child and to say, Daddy messed up. And to let them tell me what that meant for them. And you can just imagine this child at 5 and 6 and 7, or a little later at 12, 13, and 14. They had a lot of feelings about our encounter and how it had hurt them. And you know what was so hard so often to hear that? Because I didn't want to hurt them. I didn't want to harm them. And yet it was so hard to hear that I had caused them such distress because of my mistake. And so the first thing that we might want to do together, if we're to be a community that is comfortable hearing the harm, is getting our bodies and our minds and our spirits used to hearing the difficult stuff, the hard stuff, the grief that we cause, the pain that we cause, the way that has transformed people around us. We need to get used to hearing it. This is like in the church when we go through the church year and we hear the difficulties of Mary and Joseph who cannot find a place to lay their heads, and Jesus who's constantly attacked by those who are against them, and disciples who can't seem to find their place, and a Jesus who ends up on a cross, right? We tell the difficult stories through the year, so we need to get used to hearing the difficult stories in a way that open up ourselves to that other without defensiveness, without trying to fix, but with an open imagination and posture, and being willing to listen carefully to the harm that our actions or inactions have caused. But then we do something else, right? So we're open to that storytelling around the harm that we have caused. We are curious about that person's life and what's happened in the midst of the difficulty and the loss. We get open to, even when it gets difficult and gritty, even when there are tears or anger, even when there's disappointment or despair, because our actions have had those consequences. And then we too do something else. We listen carefully to that other, and we continue to explore with them with curiosity. That's less words and more presence. You know what I mean. Less defensiveness and more openness. That also means that we don't make excuses for ourselves. We just listen carefully and acknowledge the harm done, remembering that even if we do not mean something, the impact was still there. So our actions had an impact on that other, and what matters is that impact that he had in the other. This is an important wisdom from the work of Adrienne Marie Brown in Emergent Strategy, that we should often pay attention to impact, not just to what we meant to do. And so that recognition, that comfortableness with the gritty and the difficult, alongside a posture of openness and curiosity and non-defensiveness and not trying to fix, begins to create a fertile ground for us together to know that the harm can be named, that the hurt can be expressed, that the loss can be felt, that the grief can come to the surface, because that's what it means to be human. We are a people just like that. And when we do that, when we create these spaces that I'm discussing together in our one-to-one life, but also in our lives together as a community, something magical and amazing happens. Reconciliation begins to bubble up very slowly. And though we're not at the forgiveness type of place or step yet, we are literally laying the groundwork solidly so that a pathway is ready for the kind of forgiveness that is robust, Christ-like, strong, the kind of reconciliation that reflects the love of God and neighbor, and the kind of coming together in community that we need. And so for us together, the challenge is not just interpersonal, but I've been thinking this week, what does it look like for First-Plymouth to be a community that hears people's stories and allows people to name the harm? Can you imagine that kind of community? In the things that we do together, that creates these places, these greenhouses where folks can be heard and know that they're heard, where people's humanity can be not just celebrated, but truly paid attention to, and that we are helping one another humanize each other, especially in the difficult seasons of life. So people of God, here's the thing. We're human, and we're going to hurt one another and harm one another. That's part of the messiness of life together. And when that happens, there's a break in relationship with the other, with divine life, and with our deepest selves. Often, that dignity violation creates a difficult place, and a harm sometimes that we can see and at other times that we can't, but a harm that is real and deep and has effects in another person's life. So let's be willing to hear the harm that has been caused by ourselves, action and inaction, and by the systems we participate in. And when we do that, when we're willing to do so without defensiveness, and when we're open and curious, and when we don't try to fix the other, when we create those spaces, something amazing happens. The good news begins to emerge. Fertile ground for hope and peace, the pathway towards reconciliation being laid, healing around the corner. Let's go do that as we continue in this journey of forgiveness. Amen.